if you see a page of sequential art, the page speaks to you. When you see a story, the pages speak to each other.
Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedmann.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim, Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Shul Jewish Cultural Community, and Atheists United Studios. Hey, Joey. No offense to Leonardo da Vinci, who some claim was born to a Jewish mother, but when I was a teenager, I visited Paris and saw the Mona Lisa. I must confess, I wasn't all that impressed. Maybe it was because I was a comic book fanatic at the time. My head was filled with the splendid images of Jack Kirby, Will Eisner, Basil Wolverton, and so many others. It would be several years before I noticed any of these illustrations, the artwork that I love, getting respect in highbrow circles and finding its way into prestigious museums. Our relationship to art is, of course, subjective, but some of us know what we like at an early age, and no amount of lecturing or literature can dissuade us from that fact. Our guest today has been collecting original comic book art since his teenage years, and in the process has given us a remarkable new book, decades in the making.
We're honored to speak with Robert L. Reiner, who writes about, curates, and exhibits original comic and fantasy illustration art with a focus on popular culture, censorship, and social change. His new book, The Unwanted, is an illustrated adaptation of a previously unpublished Otto Binder story written in 1953. Robert, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
So, your active involvement with fantasy illustration and comic book art began in the late 1960s with a fanzine. Can you tell us about those early years and what inspired you to become an advocate for this art form?
I think for a lot of kids, comic books were sort of a window to a different world. You know, it's fantasy, it's imagination. You also get to explore just how people interact with each other. You know, everybody wants a champion, a superhero, someone who can, represent the best of the world. And I think in that way, it inspired me in my youth to try to figure out ways, well, how do I do that in real life? How do I communicate with other people? How do I make friends? How do I find commonality? And oftentimes, what comes out of comic books is this concept of a geek culture. You're a little bit different. And in that way, you're trying to find comrades, people who share the same feelings. And so in my teenage years, I thought of, well, I have all these friends that like what I like. How do I find out where there are more? And in the early days of comic fandom, what you found was that people were all communicating to each other in their local areas, trying to find a conduit to be able to speak broadly. And many of them would create fanzines. And fanzines are just these simple, oftentimes in those days it was mimeographed or Xeroxed. And the idea is that you would find people to write for them and to do artwork and things like this, and then to talk about the things they really enjoy. And so for me, I found a small community in Los Angeles where I grew up, and which is perfect. Either Los Angeles or New York are perfect locations to try to tie into those communities. And as a result, I found my own niche, my own group of people who had similar interests. And in those days, they also had something called APAs, Amateur Press Associations. So people would write something, send it in, you'd put it all together, and then everyone got a copy. And so that was a way to communicate with people all around the country. So for me, I thought, well, gee, I'd like to do something that brings amateurs and professionals together, because you really admired these pros, but how could you get them to work with you? So what it is, I created a fanzine called AmaPros, as in amateurs professionals, and I reached out to different people. Most of them said no. Along the way too, I got to know fans early in the stages of their careers. Some of them who became professionals. I'll show you one example. This was the first edition or first look at AmaPros. Now, this won't be much. It looks pretty, amateurish and all, but that's Arville Jones, a Detroit artist who later ended up doing Black Panther, Iron Man, Captain America. This was when he was a teenager doing this for me. And so what was interesting about this is that I was able to get the notice of Forrest Ackerman. Forrest Ackerman was the guy who did Famous Monsters of Homeland and, all these horror magazines. And a lot of comic book people also like films, especially science fiction, horror, all these different genres. I did too. I'd watch them on this little 13-inch black and white TV, but I loved seeing all these things, the creature features and all that. At a fantasy convention, I had one piece of artwork that was given to me. I didn't know what it was. It was a piece of pulp art by Virgil Finlay, fantastic artist. I didn't know, but I thought, maybe I will auction it off and see what happens. I put it up for auction at this convention. It sold for $14. And I was hitting myself, like, I didn't know what it was worth, but I thought it has to be worth more than $14. The person who bought it was Forrest Ackerman. And I think he took pity on me. He said, "Oh, look, I'm really sorry, guy. I really want this piece, but I'll tell you what, why don't you come to the Acker Mansion?" And I don't know if you're familiar with the Acker Mansion, but oh my God, this is like the epitome of every comic book, science fiction, horror, film fan. And it was just beautifully done. And you're walking through the person's house and I'm seeing all these wonderful things. I said, wow, would you be willing to write something for my fanzine? And he'd had a fanzine back in the 30s. He was one of the early guys. And he said, no, but maybe I can do you a favor down the line. One day I get a script and it's from Otto Binder. And I can't say for sure it came because of Forrest Ackerman, but I had no idea how Otto Binder would have my address or would know who I was. So I got this thing. I'm going to show it to you. This is the actual script. And it was written in 1953, never published. So I get this as a teenager and I think, well, gee, what do I do with this? I don't know anything about, taking this and making it to something. So I put it aside and I go to high school and I discover girls. I discover other things. I become a journalism major and wow, just forgot about it. And then what happened is Bill Shelley, who is a real comic historian, wrote a book about Otto Binder's life. And I realized, wait a minute, I have an unpublished story by him. So I checked his archives at Texas A&M University. I saw listed there, never published. So I thought, great idea. I'm going to start putting everyone together. We're jumping a half century now. So in that process, I was able to bring the team together, the people I wanted to work on this. Most importantly, someone who knew Otto Binder, someone who had done a story for him back in 1954 for EC Comics, and that was Angelo Torres. And at first blush, he said, what am I going to do with this? So I said, well, I'll lay out the story. I'll explain how it's going to work, what it's going to look like and all that, and then see what you can do. And Ange is, his nickname is Ange. Everyone calls him Ange. Ange is now 91 years old, by the way. And he said, I can't do it. It's just too much. I said, well, could you do just some of it? He said, well, maybe I'll do the cover. Long story short, he did the cover and he did the entire comic book. It wasn't a comic book, it was a graphic novel. It was designed originally to be a comic book and then it became something far more. And then I was able to get a finishing artist, Stefan Quedel, who's Austrian, which was also Otto Binder's background, to do the finishing work. And Ange said, this is perfect, exactly what I wanted to get across. And that's where we get to this big jump to where we're at.
Enjoying the show? Click like and subscribe.
That's amazing. And we'll get a little bit more into that book in a moment, but your background is also quite interesting. Your mother was born in Nagasaki and at age 20 witnessed the devastating aftermath of the nuclear bomb there. Your father was of Ukrainian Jewish descent and served in Korea. So you were a teenager during the Vietnam War and the protest movements and everything else. So how are these elements maybe reflected in your interests, the illustrations that you collect and exhibit, that sort of thing?
I think the underlying theme, not just of the things I collect, but also of sequential art, is social justice. It's talking about the human condition. Even though they're using drawings to get the message across, it's not unlike a film. In fact, they always refer to comic books or sequential art as movies on paper. And so the idea is you want to get the right angles, you want to get the right perspective, you want to tell the story and make sure it flows. In the same way, it's a perfect medium for explaining the human condition, explaining why things need to be better. And I think in a lot of ways, that reflected my experience, both from my Japanese background and from my Jewish background. If you think about it, I'm sure you know this, but Superman is Jewish. I mean, his alter ego is Kal. Well, he was born as Kal-El, and it was part of this whole idea that that during the pre-war era or the late 30s, everyone could see what was coming, but they had to depict it in a way that everyone could understand. And one way to do that was comic books, and a lot of that comes through here. The idea that you want to champion. In fact, in many ways, it's very, I would say, even religious in nature, in that you want someone who will protect the weak. And in superhero lore, it's always a supernatural figure, which when you think about it, that's the basis of religion. That's something beyond what we see in our world. It's something otherworldly. And I think in a lot of ways, EC was interesting, the comic company publisher that I followed, because they brought social stories. They brought what was happening in the inner city, what was happening with bigotry and sexism, all these things very early on in the 50s. And they were fighting against this attempt to try to quell that, much like we're seeing now, the book bans that are happening. The idea that free speech should be quashed, that you can't look at alternative scenarios. You can't see people who are different from yourselves. And I saw that early on in my life, and also in terms of what I was reading. The EC comics have no superheroes. They're just good stories. And they always have twist endings where justice prevails at the end. But I think of my own family because when I was a child, my siblings and I were all born in Japan. We came to the U.S. early in our lives. But for my mother and my father, there were 30 states they couldn't go to and be in the same place together because of the anti-miscegenation laws, that they could be arrested at any given time. And now we think that's crazy. But then again, you have places where they're trying to ban people who are gendered differently. Comics and I think sequential art and graphic novels are perfect medium for addressing those issues because they really have a feeling for it. And that's something I'm proud of, that's a legacy.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, you are a collector and aficionado of EC Comics. Could you tell our audience a little bit about that very storied company and maybe some of the artists that came out of that?
Well, it's funny because the origins of EC Comics is MC Gaines, who really, there would be no Superman, there'd be no Wonder Woman, none of these would have existed. But he died in a boating accident in the late 40s, and his son, Bill Gaines, took over. Bill Gaines wanted to be a science teacher. He wanted to be a high school science teacher and do something completely different, but it was a family business. And he realized he had to change it. He had to make it more contemporary. And so he brought in some of the best artists and writers anywhere, great storytellers all around, and he created new titles that reflected his interests, which, was science fiction, horror, crime, things that people would react to, and much of this was informed by the pulps. The pulp magazines were just very, very popular. And he realized that with good art and good stories, he could transform the industry, and he did. And his legacy still continues in that you wouldn't have had Monty Python. You wouldn't have had some of the best horror and science fiction. George Lucas always points to EC Comics as, why Star Wars exists. But even in other realms, in terms of American humor, American storytelling, it would not have happened had it not been for EC Comics. And I was very lucky because 10 years after the demise of EC, I was still able to find in used bookstores old comic books, and I was just amazed at why am I reading Superman and Batman and all this, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. These are stories that are adult, they're compelling, they're interesting, they're deep. And then the artwork, the best art, and this is something that anyone in the comics industry will tell you. These were the best artists. These were the mentors for everyone else because their art was so wonderful. And so that I collected that because I could, it was still accessible.
Yeah, so titles like Tales from the Crypt and Weird Science and crime suspense stories and Mad, and artists like Harvey Kurtzman and Jack Davis and Wally Wood, all of these guys.
They found new ways to tell stories. So, for example, when you mentioned Harvey Kurtzman, who created Mad Magazine, Mad Comics is how it started. He decided he wanted to explain his experience in the war. Many of these people had served in World War II, and they realized that the war is not to be glorified. And all these comic books that came out during the war were, there's Superman beating up Hitler, things that were ridiculous, but, they were patriotic. And he said the war isn't really patriotic, it's about people. And in Frontline Combat and Two-Fisted Tales, he told these stories from the perspective of those in the trenches. And he wasn't denigrating the cause. He was saying that this is a human toll. This is something that was real, never before seen in comics. The other things that EC did was they covered things that no one, people want to forget. For example, you're familiar with the story Master Race, Bernie Krigstein. In a comic book, they're telling the story of the Holocaust and of concentration camps. It's in a comic book. Magazines were fearful to cover it. Books, were still, treading lightly on it. And here he wanted to tell the story in a very human way about a man who's waiting for a subway train, and he sees someone from the camp, one of the guards on the other side of the track, and he realizes, oh my God, he's here. and just the chase that occurs. The storytelling was brilliant. The visualizations were brilliant. So that's one of the things that really pulled me.
That particular story, A Master Race, I do recommend that our viewers go check out. A number of YouTube videos do a wonderful job at analyzing it and talking about its legacy and impact. Really, without that comic book, specifically that story, the field itself wouldn't have progressed in the way that it did.
What's interesting too, because it was a big influence on Art Spiegelman, who did Mouse. So Art Spiegelman does Mouse. He had as a teacher Bernie Krigstein, and he talks about Krigstein wanting to be spare. Like if you see Krigstein's work, it's very, very what would you call it? It's almost like music that's just notes. His visualizations are very easy to understand because they're crisp. They're meant to be fresh. They're not annotated. They're just, this is the story. I want you to move through it. I want you to understand it. And, he just did something that was so revolutionary and influenced so many other artists who said, I want to get the story across. Much like Hemingway, hear the words, listen to the words. You don't need adjectives. The words are here. So his visualizations were really, really strong and came through. But that inspired Spiegelman, who did Mouse, who ends up becoming a Pulitzer Prize winner for that. A graphic novel wins a Pulitzer Prize, a comic book. And then two, even his telling the story of his grandfather's experiences in Spiegelman, that he uses cats and mice to depict the characters, much like something that you would see from Krigstein. The idea is that use something that brings you to the basics so you can understand this conflict. And, and if it wasn't for EC, you wouldn't see these things.
Yeah. A little bit of an aside, but I was reading recently some of Spiegelman's opinions about An American Tail, which was the animated film that came out around the same time that Mouse was being collected. And he was very upset that basically they had stolen his idea and made it kid-friendly and taken out all of the kind of drama and darkness and seriousness that he had put into that Pulitzer Prize winning project.
But see, that's a good reference, because that's what EC did. They weren't going to sugarcoat what was happening. If someone murdered someone or someone got hurt because he was a different color, they showed it. They didn't try to make it, into something else. So, there was a good influence there.
Speaking of the aforementioned adaptation of the legendary science fiction writer Otto Binder's The Unwanted, you've described it as a labor of love. Could you tell us maybe a little bit more about how you came upon the story, maybe a little bit about the story itself and why it means so much to you?
What really was a big prompt was Bill Shelley's book on Otto Binder. A while back, Bill Shelley, who's a great comic historian, comic and science fiction historian, wrote this book. I'm going to show it to you. Fantastic book. And you have to remember, Bill Shelley has done books on Harvey Kurtzman, on Warren, but he did this fantastic book and went into the life of Otto Binder. And I was just moved because I didn't know so much about him. I did know about his early work. He came to New York in 1939. He was a young kid and he's trying to figure out, where am I going to be with what I do? And he creates the first story about a sentient robot. I mean, we're talking about the early concepts of AI. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Adam Lake robot, if you've ever seen it. It's been done many, many times on TV. It's been republished in different ways, but EC published it. They did the story. And so it was very interesting to see that perspective of something there. But he actually wrote that in 1939, the amazing stories. It's called I, Robot. Isaac Asimov had apologized for the fact that they stole the title because this was the first robot title. And so he was doing science fiction in the late 30s, and he knew all these people who would later go on to do other things in comics and film and all that. And what was interesting here is that he wanted to make the transition of being able to do both. He was so prolific. He wrote thousands of stories, and he started writing for Captain Marvel, and that was a big deal. Think of Superman, but Captain Marvel was even bigger when he first appeared. And then he was still doing his books. He wrote hundreds of books, just did phenomenal stuff. But then what happened in the 50s and how he came into the CC scene is that Ray Bradbury had allowed to have some of his stories adapted for the science fiction titles. Originally, EC stole them. They took the stories and they just did something. And it's funny because Bradbury said, you know what, it's very nice that you adapted my story. If you give me credit next time and $50, you can do it again. And so they said, great, we've got to deal with Ray Bradbury. And he was very big. Binder was a contemporary and of the same caliber. And so what happened is when the comic book scare happened, when the census started coming and saying comic books are going to rot your mind, there were comic book burnings, all this stuff. Binder said, I'll write these stories, because Bradbury said, it's too risky. I can't do this. I'm going to ruin my career. Binder said, I'll do it. So he was very brave to do that. And almost all of the stories had a social justice aspect to it. A Martian is treated differently because he's a Martian. He's different. A couple can't be together because one has, this is the very story. He has hair on his body and he removes it so that he looks like everybody else, but he comes from a race that has a lot of hair. And he's in love with someone, and the person he's in love with, doesn't have hair, but she pretends, yes, I do the same thing you do. I shave the hair. So it's the whole idea of passel, the concept of passing. It was disguised as comic books, science fiction, that kind of stuff, but we're really talking about the world as it was at the time. And that's what really appealed to me about Binder. And then to know that Angelo Torres had done a story with Binder for EC, I thought, I've got to find him. I've got to, he's got to be here. And as it was, I was doing an exhibition at the Museum of Illustration in New York on EC Comics. And as a result, we invited everybody in. Angelo Torres was there. I talked to him, and that's where we started talking about this project. And to get him to actually do the work. And I have to say, he is an amazing artist today. He is such a spry guy. He's 91, but if you met him, you'd say, yeah, he's nowhere near that. He has all his wits. He has all his memories. He is such an entertaining person. And it's just, just wonderful that he's in this world.
That's terrific. Are you aware of any direct influence of EC Comics on Rod Serling and the Twilight Zone? I know that he was definitely influenced by Bradbury.
Absolutely. A lot of these were short story writers. And the short stories oftentimes first appeared in the pulps. And then detective magazines, or there were crime magazines, or every type of magazine, every type of coverage. But there's definitely a link there. And the link, it's actually interesting too, because it goes back to the 50s where we have what we call like 30-minute comedies, sitcoms. We have things every 30 minutes long. But in the old days, they used to have something called short plays. It was a genre. And in fact, I had a great uncle, William Kozlenko, who was a master of the short play. And he edited books. He edited magazines. He was the first editor of Europa, which was a predecessor of Life magazine. But what's interesting about it is that you'd go out for an evening of short plays. And if you ever hear selected shorts on public radio, that kind of thing, they're just short stories, but they were succinct. They're meant to have a bite at the end and all that. And that was perfect for my great uncle, because he would write for, Texaco Hour, they had all these different half-hour programs. And that's really the background for Rod Serling. And for many of these, because it really informed how you could tell a story in a half hour. How can you be really succinct and have it have a punch? And, and they're well edited and well filmed. And you mentioned Rod Serling, but Twilight Zone had some of the best actors. Even today, it was like, how did you ever get these guys? Because they were young, they were starting out, and this was a great way for them to show their talents.
Yeah, and the idea of hiding very important social messages within a science fiction framework, so you got to pass the censors and all of that.
Exactly. You had to have a gimmick, and the gimmick had to be a way of telling truth without offending. You could say, oh, yeah, that's right, that person was wrong. You don't realize, oh, wait, they were wrong because of their color, because of their religion, because of their accent, because of the way they looked. You would disguise it another way, but hopefully you come away with a moral, and that sticks with you. And you realize that's about being a human.
And that's certainly the case with The Unwanted.
In this case, it's interesting because the last story that ever was published by EC was Judgment Day. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but Judgment Day is a story of a planet composed of robots. And it was seeded by the Earth. And there's an emissary who comes to the planet, an astronaut wearing a helmet. He comes in, and he has to evaluate whether this planet is ready to become part of the greater whole. And what he finds is that there's something wrong here. There are two groups of robots. There are orange robots and blue robots, and they are treated differently. And one runs the place, and the other does all the menial jobs and doesn't get opportunities, doesn't get the same service. Listen, clearly exactly what they're trying to say. And I don't know if you remember the punchline of the story. So he tells the robots, we're sorry, You just haven't qualified yet. We'll come back later. We're hopeful that you're going to get there." And he gets back on the spaceship, and he takes his helmet off, and he's black. Now, this is 1953 when it was first run, and then run for the last time in 1955. The censors said, "You can't do that." And Bill Gaines said, "Why not?" He says, you can't be black." They said, but that's the punchline of the story. He said, "No, he can't be." So Bill Gaines tells the censor, "F you, I'm writing this, and if you say a thing, I'm going to tell them you did this, that you said you didn't want this because the guy was black." And it ran. And that was the very last issue of any AC comic book that ever came out. Now, what was interesting is the story that was supposed to go in there was by Angelo Torres. And it was the same kind of concept. There was a concept of someone who, it was called an eye for an eye. And someone gets killed, but he gets killed because he has a third eye, which is, for a science fiction story, it sort of made sense. But the censor said, you can't have that. And, it was X'd out. And Angelo Torres, who was supposed to have his first showing, his first only by him artwork, not in combination with someone else, got banned. So it seems rather fitting. The story of The Unwanted is similar in structure because what it has to do with people from another planet, another galactic system, coming to a world and judging them, whether or not they're now eligible to become part of something bigger. And it's a world that at first was reluctant. So they were sort of pounded into submission. And in that process, they're told, if you're at the level now where we think you're capable of being one of us, we'll tell you. And in the end, they determine something very interesting. It's a twist ending, much like an EC story. Probably it may have been an EC story originally if that didn't get in that, the company folded. But the twist ending is the key here. And to understand that I think of it as a lot like Judgment Day in terms of be careful what you want to be a part of.
Yeah, we'll leave it at that because we definitely want our audience to get a copy for themselves. It's beautiful artwork. As you said, the combination of the Torres art and the other Austrian artists kind of doing the finishes and making it contemporary and very compelling. Plus the story. And I noticed in the back when you had, or the original that was sent to you, you did make some adjustments for the comic book or the graphic novel. I imagine that was to make it contemporary, shorter, something of that nature.
Yes, in fact, I'm glad you pointed that out because I had one person say, "Wait a minute, I read that first page. It's different from what's in the book." And the thing is, there's a reason for that, and actually, there's several reasons. One is that the vernacular was very different. The term Negro was used. A lot of reference points in terms of someone turning on the radio would not have the same meaning in a science fiction story for the future. The characters' names, and this is something I thought that people might pick up along the way, but the people who people who come to the planet are Mike, and I don't remember their name, but spelled M-Y-K. Okay, so there were kind of things that weren't as interesting to me. And so I took the liberty of changing some things that I thought would make it more modern, and at the same time keep the feeling and theme of the story. But I realized that you're tinkering with someone who was writing something in 1953. Maybe there are things he couldn't say directly, or maybe there are things that would be too disguised otherwise. And so I took the liberty of being an adapter, and I gave myself permission because at first I said, no, it's got to be word for word. And I realized, people aren't going to get this. It's not going to. And even in the thing, I don't say it's the Earth, and the reveal is at the end that it's the Earth. But that from page one, we're talking about the Earth, and even his disguising of it wasn't going to come over. It wouldn't go over well with the readers. They'd say, "Yeah, all right, that's kind of cheesy." But it's not when you see how the story comes through, in terms of understanding the moral of the story, and that's how I wanted to put through.
Yeah, it is ultimately an optimistic story, and hopefully we can strive to live out that finale in the same way. There's something heartening and beautiful about how it ends.
Well, it's funny. I'm glad you said that it was heartening and positive in that way, optimistic, because when it first appeared, Amazon rated it the #1 dystopian science fiction graphic novel. I'm thinking, wait a minute. First of all, is there the category dystopian romance graphic novel? I didn't know there was such a thing as that category. The thing is that I don't know. it was out very shortly. How did it become number one? Did we sell a million? What happened? And I think it's because it was probably the only one that came out that day. No one else, you get the number one position. But I don't think it's dystopian. I think it is very hopeful.
I think it's anti-dystopian. I think that's the message. But anyway, we'll let our audience decide for themselves.
You've already shown us a lot of your very impressive, artwork that you have. A lot of people who collect original comic book art treat it as an investment. You don't sell the artwork you collect, at least not since the, $14 sale to Ackerman, right? But yeah, why not?
It's not an investment for me. And in fact, as you see, I curate shows. I've had exhibitions on both coasts. I've done books. I've done, publications. I've done articles. I want people to understand this and appreciate the artwork. And I also want to make sure it doesn't blow to the winds in the sense that I mostly collect complete stories. And I always like this phrasing that if you see a page of sequential art, the page speaks to you. When you see a story, the pages speak to each other. And it's like seeing a clip of a movie. All right, that was a really dramatic, interesting clip. How does the rest go? Without the whole story, you don't see that. And you also get into the brain of the artist because the artist gets a script. They say, well, this scene, this guy shoots that guy, and this scene, the horse goes away, and this, all these things happen. But the thing is, you got to make that into something compelling where you see the flow. And much like a film, is the angle from up here? Do we see the two people close together? Do we have a far shot? So it gives the artist a chance to be the director, to take a script and bring it to life. So for me, I try to show complete stories, and they're very hard to get these days. And I understand why, because dealers and auction houses, they can make more money typically selling individual pages. It's hard to put stories back together. I'm trying to put one back right now. I've got 3 out of 7 pages. I probably will never finish it, but the pages together tell a much better story. So for me, I have no desire to sell these. My guess is at the end, it's going to end up in a museum. Perhaps if someday there's an EC museum, that'd be fantastic. Right now, George Lucas is doing his museum in LA. It's going to be fantastic for fantasy art. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's right next to the Coliseum. I'm hoping some of my collection ends up in there because that's where people should see it, a place where they can understand it's about fantasy, it's about humanity, about creativity.
I really love what you're saying about preserving the medium as, sequential art. I may get in trouble for this in some circles, but the whole fad now of having graded comic books and their value being judged on what number gets put in the top of the plastic casing that things are in, then basically you're just collecting like front covers and back covers, and there's no comic book there. It's just an object at that point.
Yeah, I think of it as like having a gold bar. All right, so it's a gold bar. You know what it is it's such a 99.9% gold. But it's like, you can't touch it, you can't see it, you can't read it. And for all there's a brick underneath it. You don't really know what is, I have no problem with anybody doing that because people doing it as an investment. And it's perfectly fine. And I know that, when I was collecting, old time collectors, you just wanted to know you had that comic book. You didn't care the condition because you wanted to read it. And I'm not one of these people. Some people just like to smell the pages, or they like to look at the ads. And the thing is, it brings that time to you. I have a collection of EC comics. I'll tell you a story about this. I had an exhibition at the Flynn Gallery in Greenwich, Connecticut. And it's a beautiful gallery. And I showed 12 original EC stories. And I had all the commentary. I gave talks. And one day I'm giving a talk to a high school group. And a man walks in, and I'm sitting in the back. I see him in the background. He's an older person. And when I'm done, he comes up to me and says, I bought all those comic books when I was a kid. I bought them all. I loved them. And I said, oh, really? And we sat down, we talked. His name is Bill Harrison. And I said, well, tell me about your experiences. Oh, Tuesdays and Fridays, the comics would come out. I sit in front of the store. They'd come out. I go to the pharmacy. They'd be there. And I just go up to the parking lot. I find a place to sit. I just read them. And then I bring them home and I read them again. And he was a military brat. They traveled all the time. He always brought his EC comics with him. So long story short, I always have to abbreviate these things. One day he says, Rob, would you like to buy my collection? And I said, well, I probably couldn't afford it. He goes, no, I know you can't. I know it's something that you want because you will preserve it. You will not destroy it. You will not tear them up. And what happened is I bought them. I bought 225 EC comics in one fell swoop. And they're beautiful. because he took care of them. He made sure that they were pristine, they were fine. He put a little stamp of Bill Harrison on every one of them. So, he has the pedigree. I will never put those into slabs. Those will be donated as well. But it's just someone who loved them so much that he kept them all these years. He's in his mid-80s now, but he was an original buyer of them. And you remember this time, and he once went to the EC offices. He was in New York, goes up to 225 Lafayette Street, and he walks in, he sees all these people, it's their heyday, and he was just too embarrassed. He walked out. And he says to this day, he kicks himself. I could have just said hello to Harvey Kurtzman. I could have said hi to Al Feldstein or Bill Gaines or Wally Wood, and I just got too shy. And the lesson I learned from that is don't be too shy. Show up. Showing up is everything. I write people all the time. I get things back all the time. I'm just so excited because this is still a living thing. It's something where people are still learning. You have artists, writers, you have filmmakers, you have musicians even. The Grateful Dead was inspired by EC Comics. Jerry Garcia was a big collector, so it's the kind of thing where a lot of people can find inspiration from the artwork and the storytelling. And as a result, it's still a living thing.
So do you think that the type of comics, I'm sure you do, that you collect and the artwork that you collect, do you think it speaks to our contemporary times?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I always think of it, the phrase about literature. Literature is news that never gets old. In the same way, if you have a good story, it never gets old because it can always speak to you. It can even be something from the Revolutionary War. It could be something from the day of the pharaohs, any of these things. Pick your period in history. There's a lesson to be learned. And a comic book can be that powerful. A graphic novel can be that powerful because it's all about talking about the human condition and conveying to people that we're all the same. We all deserve dignity. We all deserve to be treated right. And I think, that's probably the shining thing that keeps me involved. I'm 68 years old. I'm still in this field because I love this stuff and I love the story. And I love seeing young people who, the first time they ever see Frank Frazetta's artwork, and they go, Frank Frazetta, he's blowing my mind. I have some Frank Frazetta artwork. I love it. It's beautiful. It's that kind of thing where as an artist, you're inspired. As a writer, you're inspired. That still lives. I appreciate that so much.
As Jonathan mentioned, The Unwanted is a truly unique work, and we do strongly encourage everyone to get a copy. Do you have any other projects in the works?
I have a couple, actually. I don't know if you're familiar with the artist Jack Davis. So Jack Davis was one of the EC artists, but he was probably the most prolific illustrator in American history. He did album covers, he did movie posters, he did comic books, he did bubblegum cards. He did everything. If you see his artwork, you know it instantly. Next year is the 100th anniversary of his birth. At the the Society of Illustrators Museum of Illustration in New York, we're going to be doing a show. I'll be one of the curators, showing a selection of his work. It's hard to show. It's hard because there are tens of thousands of pieces he's done, and 99.9% of them are fantastic. The ones that aren't are just really, really good. And so culling that down into a small amount is going to be very, very hard. I'm working on that right now for next summer. And then I'm also working on something with Roy Thomas from, successor to Stan Lee from Marvel. He was at DC, created so many iconic characters that you're familiar with. He has a publication called Alter Ego, which he started as a fanzine way back in the 60s. Now it's a full-fledged magazine. We're working on an entire issue just based on Angelo Torres. That'll come out early in the new year. And it's because I don't know if you know what the Flegels are, but they were the best of the best artists. You had Frank Frazetta, Al Williamson, Roy Krenkel, George Woodbridge, Nick Maglin, who was also a writer and editor. And you had Angelo Torres, the youngest of the bunch, the kid who was the last one standing. He's still here and he's still doing fantastic work. But look anywhere and find these artists, and you realize that they were the best of the best. They just inspired so many people.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Robert. It's really been a treat.
It's been a pleasure for me too. I'm glad that you're doing this. I mean, so much of this is important to be kept alive, and this is a great forum for doing it.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.